Good afternoon. Welcome to this issue briefing on Techno Nationalism. Techno Nationalism is a term that we're thinking about when we, in the World Economic Forum, talk about industrial revolutions, the fourth industrial revolution, but also technology has driven military revolutions. And so when you think about that in the context of present trends in international relations, like sharper competition and rivalry between nations, then you get interesting effects at this interface between commercial world, the defense world, the security world, and strategic issues. So intellectual property can become state secrets. Foreign investment can be seen as a national security threat. And so to help us understand this a little bit better and build on these definitions, we've got two experts with us here today, starting just on my left with General John Allen, president of the Brookings Institution, but a retired US Marine Corps four-star general with experience as commander of NATO forces in Afghanistan and also on the global coalition against ISIS, among many other roles. Turning again to my far left, Avril Haines, with a background in legal affairs, but then building towards very high-level roles in the White House as the Deputy National Security Advisor under President Obama, and also Deputy Director, CIA. So if I may start with General John Allen, how can we define techno-nationalism?
Well, first, thank you for the invitation to participate in this briefing. I think it's a very important moment, and to be on the panel with a dear friend and someone who's contributed so much to global national security or global security, Avril, is a real honor. First, the fourth industrial revolution, I think, is a very important concept. And I think in that context, techno-nationalism is also an emerging concept that really deserves a lot of attention. It comes from the capacity, the increased capacity in recent times of big data analytics, supercomputing, access to data that we could never have imagined just a few years ago. And what that has done is it has not just created, I think, a concept for techno-nationalism where states will feel a nationalist view on its technology and the development of its technology and the marketing of its technology. I believe we're going to see eventually a sense of techno-sovereignty as well, where the protection of the data, the personal data of citizens, the protection of our cyber networks, et cetera, will cause us to think more holistically about the digital environment, the techno environment, if you will, as an entire sphere of sovereignty in and of itself. And you know, one of the things we've looked at Brookings of late has been something that we call the rise of digital governance, which in the West comes from the anachronism, if you will, or the paradox perhaps, of as our digital entities, our techno entities, as they gain capacity, economic capacity, increased markets, more capacity for investment, et cetera, they begin to become digital entities, almost state-like entities unto themselves, given the amount of the population in the world that they can influence at any given moment. We use the term digital citizen because there are people in the world that feel more digitally, more aligned moment to moment with a digital entity than the sovereign government 500 miles away that just preys on them. So this whole world deserves a lot of attention. Techno-nationalism, techno-sovereignty, the digital governance. In the West, it looks like the rise of digital capacity in the private sector and a substantial imbalance in the capacity of government and governance to stay in line with it. And I've got some thoughts about the military side of that as well, because I think we're getting terribly out of balance in that regard with the potential in the West of potential surprise. So those are some thoughts I think I'll offer.
Thank you. Avril.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you as well for inviting me, and I'm not sure I'm the right expert. I thought about this, and you know, coming from the different pieces of national security and foreign policy, we look at technology in a sense through a particular lens, and I think that colors how I think about things and brings me very much into alignment with General Allen, who who I've seen amass an enormous amount of information and think about things in a very deep way on these issues. I'll just add a few things maybe to build on what General Allen said. I think that one of the most challenging things about this is actually trying to understand what's happening. So I think, from my perspective, the one conclusion I've come to is that we are at an inflection point, that there really is a significant number of things that are changing in how we think about society, about a variety of different trends that we're facing right now that are accelerating in different ways. But what I don't know yet is what this looks like in 50 years, essentially, going out. And I do think that one of the issues noted is we do have new realms as a consequence of technology through which we exercise our national power, in effect. And the internet is an obvious example of that. So is space. There are a whole variety of places where space has been around for a long time, but we are far more active in it. As a country, we are seeing other countries be active in it, and we're trying to figure out what are the rules of the road for the long term that make sense in light of the ability to develop it and work in it. And there's a national security and foreign policy component to that, obviously. In the context of the internet, as you note, it is a long trend, but one that is accelerated by the internet, that military power is not the only metric for national security and power, in effect. We saw it through the economy. It's been decades that we've seen other forms of power, but the reality is cybersecurity and the internet provides a whole nother level of influence and activity through which you might measure power, and also significant vulnerabilities in that context that are really quite challenging to think through and figure out what should the rules of the road be. And then a second trend that I think is also very challenging to think through in an effective way, but is critical, is also highlighted, I think, by what General Allen said, which is just the way I think about it is, in effect, through the empowerment of the individual, which has happened a lot through technology, right? We see more actors that are capable of posing threats, but also actors that are becoming more powerful in other ways. And from an intelligence community perspective, we would talk about non-state actors having greater opportunities to spoil government action. And that wasn't just about terrorist groups, that was also about large cabals of companies and multinational entities that are really extraordinarily powerful, sometimes more powerful than governments. And so understanding how that affects power and diffusion of power through the world is a critical issue. And then finally, the last thing I'd say, to be a little provocative, is I think that in many respects a trend that we're seeing is that we are organizing ourselves as human beings through social media and technology in many respects, in ways that are in increasing tension with our political structures. And I think that's something, just as an example, but I think there are a variety of different ways. We are part of communities, in effect, that extend well beyond our geographic basis. We do that more on a personal and professional level than we ever have before. And yet our political structures are very much geographically based. And a whole series of things where I think our organizing of, the way in which we interact and so on is changing, and our political structures are not necessarily keeping up with that, in a sense.
Thank you. General Allen, what have you been thinking about on that side of some kinds of gap opening up, perhaps, between our conventional notions of sovereignty based on territory and these communities that cross on a different level over those boundaries?
Well, Avril hit it very well. I spent a lot of time in the last several years dealing with the Islamic State, and had before that dealt with Al-Qaeda, and before that dealt with other groups. What was different about the Islamic State, and I think it will be characteristic of virtually every major terrorist organization we see in the future, is the capacity for global networking on the Internet of Things using encrypted capacity. So we will see, to Avril's point exactly, she talked about systems or methods of organization. We will see those methods of organization either have a direct national security threat to our interests, or be completely alternative systems of organization that fly in the face of the Westphalian form of government that we've had. I said a moment ago that we see technology taking off with an exponential capacity for good, potentially, but for bad if not carefully watched. But the system of government's moving along basically at a linear pace. And unless we're able to find flexibility and agility in our system of government that can keep pace with the enormous networking capacity, you know, there are more than 3 network-capable devices for every person on the planet today. Not everybody has any, but most people are now networked in ways that we've never seen before. Let me just take another second, too, to talk about on the military side. I worry about this a lot. I've spent a lot of time studying this in the context of history. Conflict is a balance between what we call the nature of war, which is the human understanding and the wielding of technology, and the character of war, which is the technology itself. When we are at our best, we have an understanding at the human level, the nature of war, of how to wield the technology. But when the technology gets out of balance, either it is inefficient or is archaic or antiquated, it doesn't make any difference how good the people are, you're probably not going to win. Or put differently, if the people don't understand what the technology now brings to the equation, but your opponent does, there's real potential here for problems. And we have seen this over and over again in history, where what we call the equilibrium between the nature and the character of war gets out of balance. I think we are there now. Avril's exactly right. We are at an inflection point where we're looking at this at Brookings and spending a lot of time looking at this, is the confluence between the emergence of big data analytics and artificial intelligence and biotechnology. Those two influences alone are going to profoundly change the 21st century. How we in the West think about this, how we in the West are willing to legislate with respect to it, create regulatory measures, et cetera, and have government be an active participant with the private sector in this process, then we'll remain in balance. If, however, the biotechnology capabilities with artificial intelligence community and the supercomputing capacity, if all of that moves away from the capacity of governance to be relevant, I think we've got a problem. Now that's in the liberal democracies. We're seeing a different activity in the illiberal states or the authoritarian states where there's actually a confluence of the private sector, if it actually is a private sector, and state-supported research and development and state activities. So there's a very interesting dichotomy which is emerging here, I think.
Thank you. Avril, do you have thoughts, having been inside the machinery of government and trying to connect policy across different functions, how do you feel about that idea that we might be on the cusp of falling behind in our capacity to keep on top of that?
Yeah, I think one thing that General Allen said that I think gets to the heart of this question, maybe with a variant on your point, is this confluence of biotechnology and artificial intelligence, which I absolutely agree is critical to what's going to happen, is also, I think, a reflection of the fact that the technology is outstripping, I believe, our ability to manage it effectively. And I think you see that in a whole series of different ways. The decision cycle has become so short, essentially, for making very challenging, important decisions. And we know that psychologically, we make different decisions when we've got very short times within which to make those decisions. You know, but that's just one example of a whole series of things. I personally feel as if I am outstripped by my technology when I think about how to manage email and, you know, the variety of other issues that one has to deal with on a constant basis. It feels, you know, when we talk about the advances in biotechnology, I remember a scientist once saying to me, you know, when I was asking about, well, but how do you think about computer science in this context, and as you know, put it up against biotechnology, and he said, the most adaptive, effective systems in the world are biological systems, right? These are the systems that really can adapt the most quickly in our known world, in a sense. And so the idea of combining that with narrow AI, right, like, is really an extraordinary thing. It's almost as if you were creating a form of general AI in that context, right? But it's a remarkable idea that maybe through biotechnology, we could actually enhance ourselves. I think it's sort of, when you think about the promise of what this could lead to, and you're not, you know, staying up at night thinking about all of the possible horrors, for which there are many, could we actually get smarter at how we manage our technology. Could we use our thinking in these ways in order to actually bring it full circle and be capable of managing the technology and using it more effectively in the ways that we want to use it without destroying ourselves, which is, certainly a huge piece of the puzzle. And I am constantly sort of challenged, certainly from the national security perspective, to think through what are the paradigms through which we can begin to get a handle on some of the threat issues that we face as society, while not making it impossible for us to realize the promise of what these technologies offer. Because it has to be hand in hand. We have to be able to develop and recognize the value that's there, while at the same time managing the threats that can also be there.
That's right.
Thank you. That's a great starter. I'd like to open it out to the audience now in case we have any questions on how to go deeper into this. I think there's a gentleman at the back. If you wouldn't mind, introduce yourself and
thank you. My name is Paulo Kumu with the Africa Platform. That's the non-profit based out of Nairobi. I think I've got two questions and I don't know who to ask them. Who to ask. Last year in the same room, there was a discussion about the Big Four and how certain tech companies have completely run rogue, but not just run rogue, they've become too powerful even for governments. And the government almost feels powerless. And it wasn't until the US came up with the regulations on securities when you realize that actually no, if governments really want to control, they actually do control. It is just that the power appears to be almost like given. And so the question I'm wondering that in the midst of all these discussions, are there anything that the governments feel they need to do to get power away from these tech companies that right now fully control everything? And sometimes they go through Congress and they behave as if Congress can do nothing to them. Rather than, I think that's the first question. The second questions come to what you have mentioned, and that is the disparity between what happens in some countries, and sometimes this has got to do with laws. I'll give you the example of my country, Kenya, where Cambridge Analytica did exactly the same thing that they did in the United States. It was extremely easy to hold them to account in the United States, but almost impossible to do the same in Kenya because the government was their accomplice. And so sometimes the question you ask that, is there a particular global norm that we need to set that tells a company it does not matter where you are, you cannot be having double standards simply because the rules are different?
Thank you very much.
Well, I think to the second point, it's very important. First of all, from my perspective, much of the rest of the century is going to be all about Africa. And Africa can be one of the great success stories of the century, or it can be one of the great sources of instability, not just on the continent, but outside the continent. So in so many ways, from my perspective, the intersection of artificial intelligence, big data analytics, biotechnology has the capacity to do enormous good across the 52 countries of Africa. What we have to do as a community of nations is to begin to focus ourselves and to commit ourselves to that end. There has to be a global norm. I don't think we can continue this process of the pillaging of countries that don't have the legal regimes in place to defend themselves from inherently extractive entities. And so here we have, I think, the challenge that has emerged between very different development models that have become obvious. Development models that are pursued by the West in general versus China, for example. Those development models are very different. And how technology as a part of those models over time, this goes to techno-sovereignty, when the sovereign package of development is delivered into a country, and part of that package of development is a technological package, which looks very different than the technological package that a Western development enterprise might seek to deliver, then we have, if you will, a bifurcated system of technology appearing on the ground and disadvantaging the countries and the peoples that are struggling, obviously, with their well-being and their quality of life. To your other point, and I'm sorry, I'll let Avril jump in on this. To your other point, our Congress has got to become more involved in this, because we cannot afford to have us move forward with a system of government that is too slow to appreciate the potential for the technological environment in which we're moving, or the threat of the technological environment. We have got to become more involved in that process, and we can't move in parallel. We need to move together. And some aspect of that, and I think it was very instructive when Mark Zuckerberg testified before the Senate last year, just about the only senator who really talked about where all of this might go between a Westphalian government and digital governance was Lindsey Graham, who said, at what point must we, the Congress, begin to regulate you in order for us to have a common vision of where this could all go? And I think that is emblematic of the dilemma that you have laid out, and I think it is certainly important for us in the United States in particular to understand what regulatory, what legislative, and what policy action must be taken by the government in order to keep the digital dimension of our economy in line with the needs of the people and in line with our system of government.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think one of the challenges in this space, in that context, is that there's a kind of a lowest common denominator that ends up ruling in many of these scenarios, I think. And so, you know, you have tech companies that basically, Facebook, for example, I think 85% of their users are outside of the United States. Right. And yet, I think many Americans think of Facebook as an American company, even though I think Facebook may not think of itself as an American company, which is a whole nother level of some of the issues associated with techno nationalism. But as a consequence, they're dealing with the rules in all of these different places, and they can use each of the rules in these different places to great effect, as they're arguing to a Senate, well, we can't, you know, comply with X, Y, or Z because we have to deal with all of these other jurisdictions. And if you want the benefit of essentially, you know, social media that stretches across these boundaries, then you're going to have to deal with the fact that we're, you know, positioned to only do certain bare minimum issues in this context. And I think we and others have to step into the breach and basically create the kind of norms that General Allen noted across the board. And it has to be something where we're working with other countries and other actors that, you know, to create that, essentially.
We should work very closely with the Chinese on this issue. If we have common norms, that is good for everybody. But if we have permitted ourselves to drift apart on the ideas of common norms at the ground level where the implementation of this goes, then we're going to be dealing with competing systems of nationalism. That's no good for anybody.
So if I may just add a point before taking another question, if sovereigns, governments are taking back some of that power, how do we protect also the other beneficiaries of technology in terms of sharing information on research, scientific research, some of the commercial benefits that spread around the world because of technology? How do we have the institutions that we need to get that balance right? When you say we should talk to China, are the institutions that we have up to that task at the moment, or is that something that needs to be built on?
I think they can be matured, just as we find in the Westphalian forms of government that there needs to be a metamorphosis of those systems of government to be able to operate within the digital environment or the techno environment. I would say that the multilateral organizations, the development banks, et cetera, need to be looking very closely to see if they're organized in ways that provide both the flexibility and agility in this very high-speed environment of technical development so that they can react and be partners, really, and frankly, not a dead weight to them. We should be organizing in ways that facilitates the goodness that comes out of technology, not attempting to contain it because we're afraid of it.
Yeah, what I would add to that is, I think one of the great challenges that you do experience is the one that you described in the General Allen just now, which is just that if I'm looking at almost any critical national security issue that has a technology or scientific component, you're constantly trying to balance, essentially. So, for example, how much do you classify in that space? Because once you classify it, it's very hard for other departments and agencies who are traditionally the ones that support the kind of scientific inquiry that you're describing to actually use it and to operate in that space, because a lot of them are not cleared for that type of thing. So there's all sorts of things that you are looking at on a base. Do we do it perfectly? Definitely not. But it's a work in progress, and I think it's one of those things that you constantly have to be working at in a way, which I think was part of what General Allen was saying. The second piece, though, that I think is very interesting in this area is that when you look at things like artificial intelligence, where one of the key limiting factors for our progress is data, sort of really quality, large data sets, and you think about, you know, the discussion that's being had about the fact that we tend to be fairly open about data, and so it's actually quite easy to suck up our data, right? But when it comes to China, for example, they're relatively closed and they have enormous sets of data, and whether or not the fact that it's more homogeneous than our data or other things like that create different, you know, it's maybe not as concerning, you know, people would say from a competitive perspective. But I think one of the issues that it highlights is that you really do need to think through these things with other state actors, and you need to promote norms that you believe are going to help you essentially achieve the scientific progress that you can from these spaces.
Thank you.
Which I think requires statements of vision.
Totally.
The Chinese, after the 19th Party Congress, declared some very clear vision on where they wanted to go in that direction. We still are struggling with how to create a vision on this. I think you've...
Yeah, we're going to take, let's see if we can quickly take the two questions at once and then a response. Madam.
So my name is Anne Mettler and I'm with the European Commission in Brussels. My name is Anne Mettler and I'm with the European Commission in Brussels. My question to you is the current setup of technology essentially incompatible with democracy? And I ask this because we see, and I'm not insinuating, that, of course, that the United States is not a democracy, but de facto, in the US, digitalization oftentimes means privatization. I mean, this is essentially what you're talking about.
That's right.
Actually, the power sits with the private sector.
Right.
If I look to China, you have what I would describe as digital authoritarianism, mass surveillance, etc. So, looking at it from a European perspective, my question is, do you see a world where perhaps in the future technology standards will be developed together among democracies to essentially have a framework that allows us to exercise our democracy? And I think you were insinuating or going into that direction. And the second question is around digital infrastructure. Because in a world, what you describe, IoT, essentially the digital infrastructure will determine everything. I mean, the vulnerabilities will increase exponentially. And it has, at least here in Europe, led to a discussion around Chinese 5G. And if you could just say something about that, how you see that, would be very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then, sir, if you could make your question brief. We'll try and cover both with a response from the panel.
Absolutely, thank you. I'm Hicham Sever, a global shaper from San Francisco. So you talked about digital citizens, and there's today a lot more common points between a young urban professional in San Francisco, Paris, London, than there is between him and a farmer in the valley in California. Do you see a future where technology brings this these communities and my generation within a national context closer to each other as opposed to dividing them, and how that future looks like?
And I'm afraid I must ask you to have around 30 seconds each.
Yeah, both of these questions are very similar. I hope democracy is not at risk. But the emergence of the digital entities in the context of the private sector seem to create a tension with the traditions of democracy. We have got to think differently about this. It doesn't mean we throw out our democratic principles or the values we stand for, which is really what liberal democracies are all about. We have to embrace those values. Now we have to think differently, I think, about what the digital world now means for us in the context of our traditional system of liberal democracy. I don't have an answer for that because it's still new. But we better start thinking about that before the drift goes like this and we are in a real political crisis that we're seeing actually in Europe and the United States right now.
Yeah, so I would second that and only add to it the fact that I think we have seen it divide more than unite, obviously, and the reality is that we want to see the kind of structure that you were just alluding to that I also believe in, but I do think then hope that another crisis is not necessary in order to create the environment in which we can actually achieve that. And I think it's worth recognizing that it takes, law is just in a sense a reflection of culture and, is a mechanism for influencing behavior. And effectively it takes many hundreds of years to develop the culture within a society that promotes it. In the cyber realm, we have a lot of catching up to do, I think, in this space. And that's a place where I think it's both culture and law and regulation. And think about it.
And democracies move very slowly, as you know, in reaction to outside stimulus. Authoritarian regimes can move very quickly. And when they are actually supported by strong digital infrastructure and the capacity, as you say, for enormous surveillance, then it looks like they're getting out ahead of us in some ways. But once democracies get moving, I think they're irresistible. And so we've just got to think about it a lot, and we've got to think about it more generally, I think.
Well, thank you both very much for moving us forward a couple of steps in our understanding of techno-nationalism. And thank you also to the audience for the excellent questions. Thanks for doing our issue briefing.
Thank you.
Thank
My
you
pleasure.
so much.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Good to be with you.
That's a good question.